A lone flare hissed into the dark sky and burst, painting the battlefield in a pale, ghostly white. For a few seconds, the night revealed its horrors: shattered earth, torn uniforms, bodies frozen in twisted silence. Then the flare faded, and the world sank back into mud-soaked darkness. Somewhere out in that void, two men locked eyes, one with a rifle, one barely standing. Henry Tandey was an English soldier known not for brutality but for uncanny survival. He had been wounded more times than most soldiers had aimed a rifle, yet every time he stood back up and returned to the front. On that night in 1918 near Marcoing, he was exhausted, bleeding from a cut above his brow and running low on ammunition. The British forces had just pushed forward. German troops were falling back, some fighting, some fleeing, some simply unable to continue. And in the middle of this chaos, Henry saw one soldier, dirty, wounded, staggering, yet unarmed and desperate. The man raised his hands, not in surrender, but in silent plea. Henry aimed. The world seemed to freeze. There were orders, clear, merciless orders about leaving no threats behind. War was not a place for hesitation. But Henry did something that soldiers rarely admitted to, even decades later. He held his fire. The wounded man gave Henry a look, fearful, exhausted, but strangely grateful. Then he turned and limped away into the smoke. No one watching realized that this moment would grow into legend. No one knew that historians, veterans, and conspiracy theorists would spend decades arguing about it. No one knew that the spared soldier would one day become the most infamous face of the 20th century. When Henry rejoined his unit, no one spoke of the incident. The night swallowed it, just another uncertain mercy in a sea of violence. War moved on. Orders resumed. Henry kept fighting. But history wasn't done with that silent moment.
Before he became a soldier, staring down the life of another man, Henry Tandey had been just another quiet face in the working class. Born in 1891 in England, he grew up in a life of manual labor, factory whistles, and long days that left the body sore and the mind numb. Nothing in his early life hinted at legend or destiny. He wasn't born into privilege, strategic brilliance, or political ambition. He was a boy who learned early how to endure hardship. When the war broke out in 1914, Henry joined the army along with thousands of others, young men driven by duty, patriotism, or simply the belief that war would be short and glorious. They marched in with clean uniforms and optimism, and walked straight into a nightmare no one had imagined. Henry earned a reputation not as a hero in the glamorous sense, but as someone who simply wouldn't die. Battle after battle, he survived artillery that tore trenches apart, charges that left men scattered like broken dolls, and gas attacks that burned lungs raw. His comrades joked that he must have been dipped in iron. His enemies never knew his name, but they came to fear the resilience of the British forces he stood among. In 1916, at the Somme, Henry dragged wounded soldiers from collapsing trenches under fire. In 1917, at Passchendaele, he held the line in a sea of mud and rain where boots were torn from feet and horses drowned in sludge. He wasn't decorated for luck. He was decorated for repeatedly risking himself for others. And yet, everyone around him fell. Friends he had eaten with, laughed with, cursed with, erased in seconds. There were no cinematic speeches, no orchestral crescendos, just sudden violence and silence. By the time 1918 arrived, something inside Henry had hardened. Not cruelly, but with a sense of fatal clarity. He had seen too much death to take life lightly. Every trigger pulled, every shot fired carried weight. He no longer saw the enemy. He saw exhausted young men who were also told to fight, bleed, and die. When British command pushed into Marcoing in September 1918, Henry moved through the ruined town with the efficiency of a veteran. Buildings lay shattered. Smoke drifted like tired ghosts. Dead soldiers lay half buried in rubble. And Henry, with his uniform torn and face smeared with grime, kept walking. This was routine, normal, expected. But fate had a way of choosing strange pivot points. Up until that night, the night the trigger stayed silent, Henry's story had been one of endurance. A man surviving against odds, fighting through chaos, performing acts of quiet courage that drew little attention. Only later would people look back and see the shape of a crossroads. Only later would they ask, why him? Why that moment? Why that one spared life? Because from the factory floor to the blood-soaked mud of France, Henry's life had prepared him for one terrible decision, whether to end a man's life or let him walk away.
The night at Marcoing had settled into that eerie half-silence familiar to soldiers. When the guns pause, the air holds its breath, and every footstep feels like it echoes too loudly. Henry moved carefully, scanning the broken terrain. The moonlight slipped through drifting smoke, revealing half-collapsed walls, splintered gates, and the glint of bayonets among wreckage. Then he saw movement. A figure stumbled out from behind a stone barrier, thin, mud-covered, visibly injured. The man clutched his side, breath ragged, uniform torn. Henry raised his rifle instantly, training the barrel on the target. It was habit, hardwired after years of war. And yet, in the next moment, something strange happened. The German soldier did not reach for a weapon. He did not try to flee. He did not shout. He simply froze and looked at Henry with hollow, weary eyes. Henry steadied his aim, finger on the trigger. He could shoot without hesitation. Most men would. Most men had. And yet, Henry hesitated. Around him the battlefield seemed to hold still as well. No bullets cracked through the air. No orders barked. Just two men staring at each other in the ruins of a war neither had chosen. The wounded German soldier slowly raised one hand, not high, not dramatic, just a silent gesture of exhaustion, a plea that said more than words ever could. Henry's mind flickered with images. Friends torn apart in shell fire, survivors screaming for medics, men drowning in mud, faces of the dead, British and German alike. All of them young, all of them sent here by older men who would never step onto a battlefield. The German soldier's face was pale, almost ghost-like. His eyes carried fear, but also recognition. Two human beings caught in the machinery of war, facing each other without hatred, just fatigue. Henry lowered his rifle, just slightly. The German blinked in disbelief. Then came that small, almost imperceptible nod, thankful, stunned, and he turned away, limping into the ruined darkness. For a moment Henry felt something unusual, relief mixed with unease. He had spared a life, but war did not reward mercy. If anyone saw him let an enemy walk away, there could be consequences, questions, accusations, court-martial even. But no voice shouted after him, no officer appeared. The night kept it secret. That night, Henry lay awake longer than most. He stared upward, listening to distant artillery rumble far off. His mind replayed the image of the wounded man again and again. A spared life, a silent exchange, a moment of compassion inside a world built on cruelty. He could not have known, no one could, that this man would later climb to power, reshape nations, and plunge the world into an even more devastating conflict. But history would remember what happened here, and in time it would question whether Henry's mercy had been humanity or tragic fate.
In the years after the war, Henry Tandey carried on life the way many veterans did, quietly, privately, without dramatic declarations. He returned to England, married, worked, and avoided attention. Medals and commendations were displayed in official records, but they gathered dust in his own home. He had survived the war, yes, but he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had seen too many faces vanish, too many futures cut short. But then, years later, the world changed. Germany was rising again, and this time under the command of a man with fierce rhetoric, burning ambition, and a hypnotic hold on crowds. His name spread everywhere: Adolf Hitler. It wasn't until the late 1930s that Henry Tandey learned the claim. The wounded soldier he spared at Marcoing might have been Hitler himself. The story surfaced when Hitler, now Chancellor of Germany, reportedly pointed to a painting of Henry carrying a wounded soldier and said, "That man once spared my life." The idea stunned people. Newspapers printed versions of the rumor. Veterans discussed it in pubs. Historians argued. Had the future dictator truly crossed paths with Tandey? Had mercy given by one soldier allowed the rise of a tyrant? For Henry, the claim was deeply unsettling. Journalists asked him about it. He confirmed the encounter with the wounded German, but never claimed with certainty that it had been Hitler. And yet, he could not dismiss the possibility either. Years earlier, he had made a moral choice. Now the world wondered if that choice had shifted history's path. Henry once remarked, with visible regret, "If I had known what he would become, I would have shot him." It was not said with hatred, it was said with weight, the weight of hindsight, of responsibility, of unbearable irony. But could he truly have known? Back in 1918, Hitler had been just another desperate soldier, no different from any other man trapped in war. There had been no uniform that marked him as monstrous, no prophecy that foretold the Holocaust, no sign that he would ignite a second global inferno. Henry had acted according to conscience, choosing humanity in a place where humanity was scarce. With time, the legend anchored itself in war lore. Henry Tandey became known not for extraordinary skill or great heroism, but for a decision that history could never quite clarify. Was he noble or unlucky? Kind or tragically naive? He would live to see the Second World War begin. He would watch cities burn again. He would witness the horrors of the Holocaust unfold. And in those moments, it is said that he felt the torment of imagining a different outcome. One gunshot in 1918 that might have spared millions. But the truth remained elusive. Eyewitnesses were gone. Records were uncertain. The claim that Hitler recognized Tandey's face from Marcoing, some argued it was vanity, coincidence, or propaganda. Others believed it completely. In the end, the moment between the two soldiers, whether between Tandey and Hitler or simply Tandey and some unknown German, became a symbol of the randomness of history. A single hesitation, a single spared life, a single choice echoing across decades. Henry Tandey would pass away in 1977, leaving behind the strange weight of his legacy. His story is not of glory, nor of villainy. It is the story of a split-second decision made in darkness, and the question that forever shadows it. What if mercy was the greatest mistake of all?
As decades passed, Henry Tandey's name never fully faded. It transformed, not into the title of a decorated hero, nor into the shadow of a villain, but into a strange paradox that fascinated storytellers, historians, and moral philosophers alike. He became known as the unluckiest soldier in the world, not because he lost limbs, or suffered disgrace, or died forgotten, but because he might have let the wrong man live. History books wrote, Henry Tandey, the most decorated private soldier of World War I. Folklore added, the man who let Hitler go. That second line, whether entirely fact or exaggerated myth, became the one people clung to. Veterans and listeners gathered in pubs, retelling the story with quiet reverence and disbelief. Imagine letting someone live and that life becoming that. But the real tragedy of Henry's legacy isn't that he spared a dictator, it's that the myth reduced a soldier's entire humanity to a single rumor. Few remembered the dozens of wounded men he saved under fire. Few mentioned his Victoria Cross, his Distinguished Conduct Medal, his military medal. Instead, the world focused on that silent moment of eye contact in 1918. Over time, Henry's life became a question rather than an answer. Was mercy a mistake, or was it proof that even in war, compassion can survive? Some argued that Henry was a tragic figure, punished by history for kindness. Others argued that the Hitler connection was never proven, that Henry had been unfairly burdened with guilt for something he could not possibly predict. Because the truth is this, in that moment of hesitation, Henry Tandey did not see a tyrant. He did not see a future dictator. He saw a wounded man, as exhausted and frightened as any other. In interviews later in life, Henry appeared reflective but calm. He never embraced the legend, never glorified it. If anything, he seemed haunted not by the choice itself, but by the meaning others attached to it. Historians still debate it. Military scholars still analyze it. Ethicists still pose it as a lesson. One soldier's decision echoing across time. Henry's story endures because it reveals something uncomfortable. The shaping of history is not always a grand design. Sometimes it is a single moment of human instinct, a moment when one person chooses compassion over violence, or violence over compassion, and the world changes because of it. So Henry Tandey remains a symbol not of failure or foolishness, but of the impossible moral dilemmas of wartime. He represents the soldier who survives every bullet, every blade, every shell, only to be struck by the cruel irony of history itself. And whether he truly spared Hitler or not, the legend stands as a reminder. No act of mercy is small. No life spared is meaningless. And no one can ever fully know what echoes a single choice might leave behind.